Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be continuing The Negro Pilgrimage in America by C. Eric Lincoln. We'll start on page 63, Reconstruction and Segregation.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Reconstruction and Segregation. The North had won the war. The Union had been preserved, and the South had come to an end of an era. Long before the final Confederate surrender, President Lincoln had decided on a plan for reconstructing the nation. With the exception of high Confederate officials, Lincoln intended to grant general amnesty to Southerners, asking merely that they swear future allegiance to the United States. When 1/10 of a state's 1860 electorate had taken such an oath and established a government consistent with the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln planned to recognize that state. Then it could be readmitted to the Union. So all they had to do was promise. Negroes were to be excluded from participating in the political reconstruction, but the president planned the creation of federal agencies that would handle the needs of Black men and women. As a general rule, the president did not intend to give Negroes the vote, although he was known to favor enfranchising a limited number of Negroes who were either property owners or whom had distinguished war records. Many members of Congress felt that Lincoln's Reconstruction plan was far too lenient. Congress responded by passing its own blueprint, the Wade-Davis Act, in July of 1864. The Wade-Davis Act provided that an oath of past as well as future loyalty be taken, an ironclad oath that arms had not been voluntarily borne against the Union. The president vetoed the Wade-Davis Act because he felt it rejected the Christian principles of forgiveness on terms of repentance. So they wanted to uphold they wanted to uphold the Confederates to a higher standard, and the president said no. That's what the radical Republicans did. Greetings, forecast. I'm so glad you're here. When Andrew Johnson became president after Lincoln's murder, the Tennessee Republican Party proceeded to implement his predecessor's Reconstruction plan. Once again, Congress rebelled and appointed a joint committee on Reconstruction, whose first task was to add to the force of Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation, a wartime measure issued by the president as an act of military necessity, merely freed those slaves in states rebelling against the federal government. The 13th Amendment of the Constitution, the first of the so-called Civil War amendments, abolished slavery throughout the nation. It abolished involuntary servitude throughout the nation. Always remember that. And prisoners are excluded from that because they can be made into virtual slaves because they're incarcerated. Citizenship and Southern reaction. Negroes finally became citizens of the United States on July 28, 1868. I wonder why they don't celebrate that day. With the ratification of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. But while that amendment was awaiting ratification, the South moved to reshackle the Negro with a series of black codes. The codes established an interlocking system of social, economic, and political controls aimed at placing the Negro in a position below that of any white person in the general population. The code dealt with apprenticeships, labor contracts, migration, vagrancy, civil and legal rights. Freedmen without lawful employment were declared vagrants. They were not allowed to purchase or lease land except in incorporated cities. They could not enter any occupation except that of farmer or servant without a special license. In effect, the Black codes implied that Negroes were to be the supporting caste, both economically and psychologically, for the defeated South. Congress moved rapidly against the Black codes and enacted a Civil Rights Act in 1866. The law granted federal protection to the Negro in a variety of social situations and was also intended to protect him against physical violence. President Johnson vetoed the legislation, but Congress overrode his veto. In March of 1867, Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act aimed at defeating the conservative Reconstruction policies of President Johnson. The act provided for military rule in the South until such a time as individual Southern states met certain political conditions. The Southern states were divided into 5 military districts, and the state governments already recognized by Johnson were abolished. New elections were called to fill state offices. Congress declared that no state could be represented in the national legislature or be returned to civilian control until a duly elected state convention ratified the Civil War amendments to the Constitution. Tied to that provision was the additional requirement that Negroes be given the vote. Those Southerners who had held high military or political positions in the Confederacy were barred from taking active roles in the state conventions. Interesting. The Negroes as lawmakers. Of the 1,330,000 voters registered under the Reconstruction Acts, 703,000 were Negroes and only 627,000 were whites. The Negro majority happened because many whites could not take an oath that they had not given aid and comfort to enemies of the United States. But Negroes did hold population majorities in the states of Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, and South Carolina. The new laws also benefited poor whites, who for the first time were freed of restrictive property qualifications and were able to vote. 2 Negroes, Blanche K. Bruce and Hiram R. Revels were elected United States Senators from Mississippi. Between 1869 and 1880, a total of 22 Negroes served as members of the House of Representatives. The elections conducted under the Reconstruction Acts also sent several Negroes to high public office in Southern state governments. Francis L. Cardozo became the treasurer of South Carolina. J.C. Gibbs was elected Secretary of State for Florida, and Pinckney B. Pinchback served briefly as governor of Louisiana. Negroes were also elected to state legislatures. Both in South Carolina, they constituted the majority of the lower house, while whites contained and retained control of the Senate. Some Negroes elected to state offices were both illiterate and incompetent, for it had been illegal to educate a slave. Consequently, some freedmen lacked the education and experience to fulfill their duties as lawmakers. However, the overall quality of Negro legislatures in state houses appears to have been quite high. One indication is that the state constitutions written by the so-called Black Reconstruction governments remained in force long after 1876, when Negroes and radical Republicans lost power. The South Carolina Constitution of 1868 was not rewritten until 1895. Mississippi did not adopt a new constitution until 1890, and the Virginia Constitution remained in force from 1870 until 1902. Real control and power. The majority of local, state, and federal officials were not Negroes, but Southern whites. Some whites, adventurers who became known as carpetbaggers, came from the North to make financial profit from the defeated South. Generally, the Northern carpetbaggers had little concern for either the Southern whites or the Negroes, although they were able to count upon Negro votes by passing themselves off as Northern friends. The carpetbaggers were joined in their exploitative practices by some white Southerners known as the Southern Scalawags. The two groups dominated local governments while selfishly lining their pockets with corruption-stained cash. The struggle to learn. Realizing that education was the greatest need of Negroes if they were to realize the benefits of their freedom and have any lasting role in the nation's political affairs, Black Reconstruction legislators concentrated on public education. South Carolina led the states of the old Confederacy, providing free public education for both white and Negro children. Other states where Negroes were politically powerful followed South Carolina's example. Hundreds of white teachers from the North journeyed south to establish and staff schools, academies, seminaries, and colleges. An army officer, General O. Howard, head of the Freedmen's Bureau, founded Howard University in Washington, D.C. Many of today's leading Negro colleges and universities are products of combined white and Negro dedication to education. Some of the schools founded during the Reconstruction period are Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia, Hampton Institute in Virginia, Talladega College in Alabama, Tougaloo College in Mississippi, Morgan College in Baltimore, Maryland, Knoxville College in Knoxville, Tennessee, and Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. By 1870, approximately 150,000 Negroes were enrolled in Southern schools taught by 3,500 teachers. Many of the students attended classes at night with candles or oil lamps, more often than not, the only illumination. 25 years later, 1 million Negro children were the pupils of 25,000 Negro teachers who had been trained by white instructors from the North. Many white teachers were suspected by the Southerners of teaching social equality to Negro students. As a result, a large number of schools were burned and the teachers forced to return north. This was not true in every section of the South. In cities such as Baltimore, Richmond, and New Orleans, Southern white women taught Negro children and encouraged them to aspire to higher stations in life. The problem of earning a living. While vast numbers of freed Negroes hungered for an education, they were faced with the more immediate problem of earning a living. The Freedmen's Bureau Act, passed over President Johnson's veto in 1866, provided for the assignment of confiscated Southern land to Negroes. But Mr. Johnson's policy of restoring the lands to white ex-Confederates nullified the Act's provisions. Furthermore, Reconstruction left the whites with land, but without either money or labor to develop it. Since Northern bankers had investment capital and Negro labor was abundant, the major question facing the South was how to bring together the land, the money, and the labor in an economically profitable enterprise. So that's all they were ever concerned about, is creating an economically viable enterprise. Sharecropping was the South's answer to the problem. The financiers lent the farmers money, and the farmers, in turn, used it to purchase tools, seed, and food for Negro workers. Sharecropping bound Negro families to the land and white landowners almost effectively as, and to white landowners almost as effectively as had slavery. The landowner took a lien against the tenant farmer's share of the crop. The lien was the lien was security for the landowner's investment of seed, livestock, and food. When accounts were settled after harvest, the sharecropper, theoretically at least, was supposed to share the profits that remained after the crop was sold. In fact, the usually illiterate tenant always found his account was overdrawn. When he had been advanced more for food, clothing, and other necessities than his share of the harvest was worth. As a result, he found himself in debt to the landowner. To wipe out the debt, the tenant was required to make a crop for the same landowner the next year. By the time the second year's crop was harvested, the tenant was usually more hopelessly in debt than before. If a tenant tried to leave the farm without paying off his so-called debt, he and his family could be, and often were, jailed and fined. The fines were paid by sending the tenant back to the same farm to work off the fine, usually less than $1 a day. Much of today's present race problem in the South has its roots in the Reconstruction period, especially in the creation of the sharecropper class. The poor whites, who had generally lived in the hills and on the less productive lands adjacent to the plantations, found their traditionally marginal incomes reduced further still after the Civil War. The post-war competition for jobs on farms, in the building trades, and elsewhere increased the bitterness and resentment between the poor whites and Negroes. Even before the war, competition between Negro artisans and mechanics and their poor white counterparts had become acute. In 1845, the Georgia legislature barred the making of contracts with Negro mechanics, whether slave or free. In spite of such attempts to restrict their employment, skilled Negroes in Charleston, New Orleans, and other cities held a virtual monopoly on the mechanical trades. In Virginia, some former slaves worked in the production of cotton textiles, tobacco, iron, and flour. Of the 120,000 artisans in the South at the end of the war, 100,000 were Negroes. They were employed as gunsmiths, plasterers, cabinet makers, blacksmiths, masons, riverboat pilots, and even engineers. The rise of segregation. Slavery had been justified in the South on both theological and sociological grounds. Segregation's excuse was purely biological. The segregationists believed that the Negro's biological inferiority made him incapable of intellectual, artistic, or moral achievement. Segregation was developed by white America as a means of ensuring social, political, and economic distance between the races. To keep the Negro subservient, it was necessary to keep him poor and uneducated. But at the same time, the Negro's labor was necessary to the restoration of the South's economy. Ironically, the preservation of the segregation became the special function of the poor white who had been traditionally victimized by the prevailing economic, social, and political conditions as the Negro. So poor white people were in the same position as Black people. But remember, it's been said that if you can convince the poorest, lowest white man that he's better than a Black man, he will gladly give you his money because he's proud to not be, at least he's not a Negro. Or segregation presented the poor white with a psychological release so strong that he simply overlooked the common lot he shared with the Negro. Awarded social certification as the Negro's supervisor, the poor white flaunted the white supremacy code because it artificially raised his position in society. The Ku Klux Klan. While almost every Southern institution was committed to the white supremacy doctrine, it was the Ku Klux Klan which became the most notorious organized organization in the doctrine's enforcement. The Klan was organized at Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865 by Confederate General Nathan B. Forrest, the former slave trader. The Klan allegedly began as a social club with certain distinctive ritualistic costumes, but it was soon discovered that the Klan's mysterious hooded white robes intimidated Negroes. Composed largely of lower class whites, the Klan ironically became the self-appointed preserver of the Southern way of life as it had been envisioned by the white aristocracy. Operating mainly as night riding terrorists, the Klan thrived on violence, floggings, lynchings, arson, and murder. Congress finally enacted a series of force laws aimed directly at the Klan, but the organization continued to operate. Between 1870 and 1900, thousands of whites were arrested for Klan butchery and more than 1,200 were convicted. Still, the Klan functioned openly until it had accomplished its primary goals of reducing the Negro vote and restoring control of Southern governments to whites. The original Klan finally faded, only to rear its ugly head again in the 20th century. And you got to remember the Klan was a place of power because it was like a network. It was like whether it was like the Jewish synagogue, or it was like the local businessmen's association. It was like the Lagrange associations of the past. These were places where these people networked. So very powerful people in every community were members of the Klan. It wasn't just the poor whites. We're talking judges, politicians, lawyers, congressmen, senators. We're talking these type of people were attached to the Klan. Reconstruction ends with a deal. The presidential election of 1876 was the death knell of Reconstruction. The Democratic candidate, New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden, had earned a reputation as a vigorous reformer by breaking the vicious Boss Tweed ring in New York City. His opponent, Republican Governor Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, had served as a congressman and as a major general of the Union Army during the Civil War. The election returns from Oregon, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina were disputed almost as soon as they were counted. Since the Constitution did not provide for such a contingency, a congressional commission was created to settle the matter. Hayes was declared the winner by a margin of one electoral vote, 185 to 184 for Tilden. Before assuming office, President-elect Hayes assured the Democrats that if they would not contest the election decision during the commission, he would withdraw the remaining Northern troops from the South when he entered the White House. Hayes kept his part of the deal, and with Union soldiers gone, Southern whites immediately removed all Negroes from public office. The forecast says the police chief, all of them were and still are connected to the Klan. They absolutely are. And Rutherford B. Hayes sold us down the river because he wanted to be president, and he said he would remove the soldiers if they wouldn't contest his election so they could do what they wanted to do. And they immediately went about removing all the black people from office. They called it Redeemer governments. It's a forecast is letting us know that they called them Redeemer governments. The court sanctioned segregation. The Negro's place in society became a matter of law in every Southern state during the 1890s. But the long legal history of racial discrimination and segregation in the United States antedates or comes before the Civil War. One of the earliest trials involving the issue of segregation arose in the North in 1849. The case was Roberts versus the City of Boston. A Negro girl tried to enter an all-white school in Boston, where a local ordinance provided for segregation of white and Negro pupils. Boston lawyer Charles Sumner, later to become a famous legislator, argued for the plaintiff that the Massachusetts Constitution, in declaring all men to be free and equal, meant that all men, and women for that matter, were entitled to equal protection under the law. The segregation of the Negroes in separate schools, Sumner contended violated the principle of equal protection and deprived Negroes of their rights as defined in the state constitution. Sumner's argument was the first in which the concept of equal protection under the law was introduced into a racial controversy. The Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled in favor of the city of Boston. The court held that segregation did not in and of itself constitute discrimination, and that if caste distinction is created or increased by segregated schools, it is not created by law and probably cannot be changed by law. 6 years later, in 1855, the Massachusetts legislature passed a law prohibiting the segregation in schools, in public schools, but the damage had been done as far as the Negro was concerned. Roberts versus the City of Boston has been established as legal precedent for similar cases across the land. Following the Civil War, state-enforced segregation received court approval in New York, Ohio, Missouri, California, and various other states outside of the South. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 was the first racial segregation case decided by the United States Supreme Court. Homer Plessy was 7/8 white and 1/8 Negro. He charged the Louisiana statute requiring segregation on trains within the state violated rights granted to him by the 13th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. Plessy's main argument was a warning that if a physical distinction such as skin color could be used as the basis for segregation, then discrimination against blondes and redheads could also be considered reasonable and legal. Furthermore, argued Plessy, in providing legal sanction for the segregation of some of its citizens, Louisiana implied that such citizens were inferior. In an 8-1 decision, the court denied that segregation by race necessarily implied racial inferiority, declaring the case to be reduced to a question of whether the statute of Louisiana was a reasonable regulation. The court held that for a legislature to act in conformity with the established usages, customs, and traditions of a people, and the preservation of public peace and good order was in fact reasonable. As might have been expected, the court cited as a precedent the earlier case of Roberts versus the City of Boston. So precept upon precept, line upon line, they take one case and they apply it to multiple situations. Greetings, Brother Bakari. Associate Justice John Marshall Harlan dissented. In the view of the Constitution, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. But the court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson established the separate but equal doctrine that remained a legal guidepost until May 17th of 1954. The Supreme Court's view on matters of states' rights affecting the Negro was evident even prior to the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson. It began with the slaughterhouse cases, 83 U.S. 36 of 1873. The cases hung on an interpretation of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. In 1869, the Louisiana legislature granted the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company the exclusive privilege of slaughtering animals in the New Orleans area. The local butchers charged that their property, that is, their right to labor, had been taken from them by the terms of the charter. In a 5-4 decision, the court held that the Due Process Clause only granted protection of national citizenship rights, but did not throw a mantle of protection over state citizenship rights. The decision weighed heavily upon the Negro because the states exercised control over such matters as public transportation and education. The forecast says it's interesting. It was always the mulatto they used to pass laws about segregation and blackness. Yes, it is interesting that they always use the mulattoes to pass those laws. It's almost as if they wanted the perfect victim, which is one of the reasons why they picked, while Rosa Parks was not. Well, no, she did consider herself a mulatto because I think she said that she was Indian and something. But that's one of the reasons why they picked a person like Rosa Parks who didn't have a baby instead of the actual person who was the first person to refuse to give up her seat. They are looking for the perfect victim so that they can present their facts in a way that most benefits them. So they're looking for a mulatto, somebody that's mixed race, somebody that can pass, somebody that's respectable, somebody that doesn't have a bad history, someone without a criminal record, somebody that doesn't have a child out of wedlock. They're looking for the perfect victim. Another Supreme Court interpretation adversely affecting Negroes in the United States was United States versus Cruikshank, 92 U.S. 552 of 1876. In that decision, the court refused to punish persons who had broken up a Negro meeting at which a forthcoming Louisiana election was being discussed. The court held that breaking up such a meeting could only be a crime if the meeting had been concerned with a national election. So they didn't even have the right to discuss local elections in small groups. Yet another court decision restrained the emancipated Negro. In the civil rights cases, 109 U.S. 3 of 1883, the sections of the 1875 Civil Rights Act prohibiting discrimination in places of public accommodation were struck down by an 8-1 decision. Again, Mr. Justice Harlan was the lone dissenter. The South interpreted Plessy versus Ferguson as judicial approval for the complete separation of the races in every aspect of public life. This includes schools, trains, buses, public buildings, parks, playgrounds, waiting rooms, water fountains. I want to add libraries to that list. None could be so used jointly by Negroes and whites. The South did make some sort of effort to make provision for the Negroes, but it could not realistically expect its truncated economy to support a completely duplicate system of public facilities and institutions. Negroes were provided with some schools and some public libraries, but those libraries had a limited number of books. But they were equally admittedly inferior and were seldom, if ever, equal to corresponding facilities provided for whites. Public auditoriums, fairgrounds, exhibition halls were often set aside for the exclusive use of Negroes at certain times of the year. It was a common practice in most southern cities to permit Negroes to attend the public zoo on one afternoon each week. All this was considered legal and adequate within the separate but equal doctrine laid down in the court by the courts in Plessy versus Ferguson. New philosophies and new directions. Just a few months before the decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, the most prominent Negro in America took a position that appeared to condone the philosophy of racial segregation. It happened during the 1895 Cotton States International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. Booker T. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee, set forth what had been called ever since the separate fingers doctrine, in which he called upon his race to concentrate on gaining material advantages through work rather than social equality through agitation or militancy. To many people, it seemed that Washington had settled for all time the issue of the proper relationship between whites and Negroes. In his speech, Washington asserted that Negroes and whites could subsist equally and simultaneously as each finger on a hand. Therefore, whites need not fear independent Negro progress. The view was widely praised in the national press, and Booker T. Washington was hailed by many whites as a rational and reliable Negro spokesperson. Meanwhile, an increasingly vocal segment of Negro leadership contended that the full rights of citizenship guaranteed by the Constitution could not be realized within the narrow confines of Washington's theory. In 1898, the dream of peaceful relations between the races in the South was rudely challenged by widespread outbreaks of racial violence. Riots, lynchings, and progressive disenfranchisement of Negroes darkened the closing of the 19th century and the opening of the 20th century. Greetings, Realm in the Bush. How are you tonight? Little by little, Washington's philosophy was repudiated as weaknesses began to show the fabric of his argument. It became increasingly evident to his foremost critics that the only efficacy of the law, fairly administered to all citizens, could protect the Negro minority and ensure its full participation in every aspect of American life. 30 prominent Negroes, led by W.E.B. Du Bois, met on July 29, 1905, at Fort Erie, Canada, in the interest of aggressive action on the part of men who believe in Negro freedom and growth. They founded an organization known as the Niagara Movement, a group that evolved by 1909 into the NAACP. So as you can see, Eric Lincoln has a lot of interesting ideas because there was a distinct difference between the Niagara Movement and the NAACP. We know that the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was really founded by Jews, but they want to say that the Niagara Movement was the precursor to the NAACP. A lot of the same people were involved in those movements, but the reality of the situation is that they had totally different foundations and origins. I know that it's only been 40 some odd minutes, but the next chapter is kind of long, and I'm not going to get a chance to get into that tonight. But did you have anything that you wanted to say tonight? Anything about the mulattoes? Anything about how we have consistently been disenfranchised? How they've used laws over and over and over again to take away our rights and our personhood? How consistently they have figured out ways to take away the little bit of respectability that we have, and that even to this very day they do those things? I know that um, there are a lot of different ways that we fight back and that we have fought back historically, but I also know that they're always thinking. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you tonight? I know that they're always plotting and planning. I know that they always have a way to, they're always thinking of ways to disenfranchise us. They never sleep. They have people, they fund think tanks. And we don't fund our think tanks. We don't pay our thinkers. We don't really pay a social media personality like Tariq Nasheed, but we won't fund a think tank that says, okay, we want to actually do something. We will do things in ways we will do things in ways that don't make a lot of sense, and we don't organize ourselves around an idea that is going to benefit the mass of our people. We organize ourselves around ideas that's going to benefit one person. So we have to reprioritize those things. All right, guys. Tonight was kind of short. Tomorrow night we'll be reading chapters 6 and 7. So it's going to be a little bit longer than normal. No, 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 not tomorrow. It'll be Monday. Monday we'll be reading chapters 6 and 7, where they talk about the northern migration here in America. I appreciate each and every one of you for listening tonight. I know that KW Don 7 is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine podcast is listening. I know that Oni from the Pro Black Perspective is listening. I know that the staff at the Daycare Ladies Network and the staff at Jesse's Kids are listening. I know that Tinkerbell 87 is listening. Afro Native is listening. I know that I have a new listener named Denial is listening. I appreciate the forecast, Anthony McPhail, Realm in the Bush, and Brother Bakari for being here with me when I read it live. I thank each and every one of you. All right, guys, I will talk to you Monday. Yes, Memorial's Day. I will talk to you Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Peace, guys.